We're going to be continuing with our JavaScript programming concepts, and today we're going to be learning about arrays, loops, if statements, and how we use logic to solve problems, and we're going to be doing that in JavaScript. To review, remember all of our scripts need to be inside a script tag. So if we want to use JavaScript, we need to put that in our HTML in a script tag. So you'll see here in line 25, I have a linked JavaScript file that is inside a script tag. You could do it embedded, you could do it inline in the actual HTML code, but what we want to do is linked, not style sheets, but linked JavaScript files, but the same way we do CSS. If you remember back from the last video, functions are blocks of code that we save for later. So we can write some code, hold it there, it's in a container called a function, and that container waits to be run until it's called. Oftentimes we call it with an event. So an event calls a function. It doesn't always have to, but it's really helpful that we do it that way. And so an event can be something like onLoad or any user interaction. So when the user clicks on something, so onClick, lots of different events that we can use to call functions, or we could just call the function by itself later in the code whenever we need it. To review our variable data types in JavaScript, we have strings, which are text strings. We have numbers, which are exactly what it says. We have Boolean, which is true, false. And then today we're really going to talk about arrays and objects. So arrays are a list of variables, and an object is essentially a complex array, or an array of arrays. So we'll have several different ways of looking at ways of storing data and information. So variables, so for example, x equals 1, just a way of storing information. And so remember, we can type that in like this, x equals 10, and that would be a number type. But that's not the best way to do this. Remember, the first time we want to do it, we want to declare it as a variable, so we'll do var equals. So we can do var equals that, var username, name equals Stephen. So there's just two examples. One's a text string and one is a number. But what we want to get into today are arrays. So let's start with one. And for today's example, we're going to use baseball. I love baseball. I'm glad the baseball season has started. And so we're going to jump in with some dummy data that I made up, but it's using baseball teams to help us to understand that. And I will change our different, we'll use different types of examples throughout this class, but today, baseball it is. So we're going to create a new array called teams. And there's a couple of different ways we could do this. We can do new array. And it used to be that this is what was accepted, but the kind of the new kind of standard for doing this is to go ahead and include the empty brackets on the inside. So you may see this in documentation with the brackets or without the brackets. Both are actually correct, but this is more correct, or the better way to do this. And so when we start linting our code, which we'll talk about later, linting it would ask for these brackets to be declared inside of it. So this is how you can define a new and empty array. Oftentimes, you see the array declared with data inside of it. So you could also do it this way. And so I'm going to go ahead and add Braves, comma, and then you can put a space. It's not required, but it's a standard practice to make it easier to read. Put the Yankees, and we'll just do 3 teams to keep it short. And we'll do Nationals, semicolon. And then I can go ahead and set my wins. Note that when we do an array, when we have this list, we put a comma between each item. But that comma is not required on the last item, because the comma says there's one more coming, there's one more coming, there's one more coming. The last one, you don't want the comma. So you'll see we don't have it here in the last one. And then let's go ahead and do losses equals and this is just made up data. All right, so we have right here 3 different arrays. 2 are numbers and 1 is a string array. Now, one thing we always want to do is to remember that in most computer programming concepts, everything starts with the count of 0. So in these arrays, we have 3 items. But the count will be 3, but they will have an index of up to 2 because the first one is 0, the second one is a 1, the third one is 2. Same with wins. We have a count of 3, and the first item is the 0 index. So if you hear me talking about the index, that's what I mean, is the first item in the array. Or, sorry, the index is the actual what item of the array we are on. The 0 is the first item of the array. So we can log this data. So we'll just test it a little bit. Log teams. So I come to my console, and you see it now puts it as an array, which is the data type, and it has a length of 1, and there's nothing there. Why did that happen? Well, let's look real closely at what I did. I used the plural when I defined this array, and then the second time I did it singular. Well, our good programming concepts would be when we use arrays, it's easier to remember and to think through it is if we have plural form. So I like to, whenever it makes sense, to use the plural form for arrays of teams. And so essentially what I did was I actually had one that had been declared but no items in it. The second one was a second array with a totally different name because it didn't have the S on it, and it did have it in there. So I did that to show you that it does matter, and that we do want to follow plural form for our arrays, but this declares it, and then this second line populates it. The first line is not necessary in this case, but we will keep it so you'll have an example. So now I want to refresh this again, and you'll see, oops, let's save it first. Now refresh again, and now you'll see that the array has 3 items, the index of 0 Braves, 1 Yankees, 2 Nationals. So the console helps me to see what data has been stored, especially if we start loading external data into arrays, it'll be really helpful to see it in that format. So we can log the teams. Now we could log wins or any of these arrays. Okay, 62. But we can also log just one index of it. We use the bracket form to do that. So bracket index number, and we will, oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. Refresh there. Note that I'm using Command S to save, and then I Command Tab to my browser, and then Command R to refresh, so you can get it really quickly. So here we have wins of 62, the first index. Now, if I change my X to, let's just set it to 2, okay, I could also put in here X as a variable. And so I could say, find the X index. So in this case, I want you to think right now, what's it going to display? It's going to X equals 2. So wins, it's going to do 0, 1, 2. It should display a 66. So let's refresh it and see, yes, it displays 66. Okay. So several different ways we can just display or retrieve the data outside of the array. Now I'm using console log just to pass information back and forth. This is, as a developer, this is really helpful just to see it, but you would probably want to be writing that to the page. So we could use document write for testing purposes. We probably shouldn't use that on a regular basis, but for us to do that, I can just go ahead and do document.write parentheses, and then I could do the same thing. And then refresh it and see now it shows it on the page. It does display it. Note that the spaces are not there because it's just spitting out the data, and so we'd need to format that and deal with that later. Note that document.write, it gives you a warning, it's not an error, but it is a warning that says you probably shouldn't use this in production. There are other ways to do that, and so we would probably use the get element by ID. So remember last time we talked about concatenation? What we can do is concatenate several of this information to build a sentence that actually makes a little bit of sense. So let's first start with let's get an element by ID. So if we look back at our HTML, we need to put in an ID. So we'll just do div ID equals teams. And so now I have an empty div here. And then on my main.js, I'm going to go back, and instead of doing the document write, we'll do get element by ID. And then which one do we put in? We just put in teams. And then the function the command we're going to run is enter HTML equals. And then let's just do the first item. So we're going to get the first item of all three of these arrays. So we'll do teams dash 0, sorry, not dash, a bracket. So the index 0. So in this case, it's going to say Braves plus quote, let's do wins plus, so concatenating with the number of wins, index of 0 plus. Now, we need a space because it's going to concatenate this exactly like we write it. So without the space, there would be no space between the number and the next word. So I'll go ahead and put that in. So losses, and I'll go ahead and put a space, plus losses 0. Okay, I have a little bit of an error. Get element by ID is not a function. Sorry. Capital D. Should have been a lowercase d. I don't know why I always do that. Actually, I do this often when I type this function. So sorry about that. So refresh that. Let's try again. Okay, there we go. Braves win 62, losses 58. Okay, so we've got the data, retrieved it from there. Now you could make a line for every one of those, but that would be really slow. And that's where loops come in to help us to make this a little bit faster. So let's talk about the two main types of loops that we're going to be using. There's a for loop and a while loop. The for loop is probably the one that's most common for the kind of work that we're going to be doing. I like the for loop. It's easy for me to think through the logic, but while loops are powerful too. So I'm going to put these in a little English form that I like, and then we'll work through examples in a second. So the for loop. For as many times as something is true, do it. Do something. Okay? Do that until it's no longer true. Okay? Now, the while loop is while I am true, do something. Now, they sound very similar. Okay? So the while loop is going to keep running as long as one particular thing doesn't change. But most of the time, a for loop is using on a count variable. So we count the number of times through the loop, and using that count is really how we determine when to stop the loop. Okay. When something changes so many times or it gets to a value that's equal to another value, that's when we stop the loop. For while loops, those tend to run all the time until something changes from true to false or false to true or something like that, or it changes from a 0 to a 1. And so let me give you some examples, and we'll put them into practice. So let's do a for loop. So we're going to keep this document get element by ID, but we're going to use that a little bit differently. Okay, let's go ahead and create our first for loop. And so a for loop starts with for, which is really easy. And then all the loops will begin and end with parentheses, and then they have the curly brackets, and then you put the code that happens inside the loop inside the curly brackets. So inside the parentheses, we do this kind of declaration that is for all for loops. So first we define an initializing variable, which is I most of the time, var I equals 0, so starting at 0, semicolon, I is less than a number, so we'll just say 2. We're going to have this run 2 times, or 3 times right now. And then we're going to do I plus plus. Okay, now we haven't talked about plus plus yet, but that is a way to increment by 1. So essentially, whenever you see I plus plus or a number plus plus, what that really means is I plus 1, or sorry, I equals I plus 1. Okay, whatever it currently equals plus 1. So I plus plus is a much faster way of writing that. And it's going to increment by 1. So we want to just go ahead and log how many times we go through the loop. So let's just do console.log and then inside the loop. And if we do plus I, we can see what I equals each time. So I'm going to save that. And let's test here. Okay. Inside the loop, it did a 0 and a 1, so it ran twice. Why did it run twice? So let's look at what it did. So we said we're going to start at 0, and we're going to run as long as I is less than 2. So less than, I didn't put less than or equal to. Okay, so if we wanted to run 3 times, we could do less than or equal to. Okay, so as long as I, which starts at 0, is less than 2, it's going to run. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and change it to less than or equal to 2. And we refresh, and now it ran for a 3rd time. Now this is just console logging some stuff. We want to be a little bit more informative. What we could do is console log, and then this time we could do all the different teams by an index of I. Because I is a variable. So remember we used x before to put in and get a specific spot of that variable. Now what we're going to do is every time we run through the loop, I gets a little bit higher. It increments by 1. And so teams 0, teams 1, teams 2. Okay. And so we're going to have teams I. And so now we should see Braves, Yankees, Nationals. Okay. And I'll comment this out so it looks a little better. Braves, Yankees, Nationals. Okay, that displays that there. Now, if I didn't have this at the right number, it would have been, it could have been only a partial part of the list. So what we want to do is make sure that the list is the right length of time. So instead of using a number variable here, we can use the length of the array. So we can use teams.length to make sure that it goes the right number of times for the item. So let's go ahead and save it, and then we're going to refresh it. And we get an extra time through the loop. So we get something that says undefined. So it said Braves, Yankees, Nationals, undefined. Why is that? Because remember I added that less than or equal to make the 2 go to a 3rd time. We want to remove that. Most of the time when you see a for loop, it just says for as long as it is less than the length, and because we start at 0, right? And so we'll keep that in. So as long as I is less than the length, go through the loop. So here, let's try it again. So now we have Braves, Yankees, Nationals. If we were to add a 4th team and we called it the Dodgers. I need a comma here because I added another item. And refresh it, it keeps going. So as our data gets grows or shrinks, the right number of times through the loop will work because we use length instead of an actual number. Okay, but to keep everything consistent, so we only have 3 items for each one, I'm going to take off Dodgers. All right, so we have, remember, before I wrote this with an index of 0. Now what I want to do is write this with an index of I. Instead of writing this over and over again, now I'm going to actually cut this, and I can put it inside the loop. And watch what happens. Okay. Nationals wins 66, losses 56. Now you would think that it would have actually put in all the different teams, just like we saw in console log. But what's happening here is when we said get element by ID, the first thing it did was it put in the Braves. The second thing it did was put in the Yankees. The third thing it did was put in the Nationals. So in this case, it will always display whatever was last, okay? And that's not really what we want, okay? We want to actually build on it. So I like to use the plus equals operator to help with this. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to take that document.getElementById, and we're going to leave that outside the loop. And then here we're going to create a new variable called HTML builder. And it plus equals, oops, okay, which is how we basically take whatever it currently equals and add to it. So concatenating on its previous value. And so we're going to say teams I plus, and then actually what I'm actually going to do here is just copy this because it's exactly what I need instead of typing it out. But let's walk through what I did. HTML builder equals teams I, the wins I, losses I. Okay. Now, one extra thing I need to do is let's go ahead and define this variable up here. We'll just create it as var HTML builder equals, and I'm going to make it an empty string, intentionally making it an empty string so that when we do the plus equals whatever was there, which will be nothing, we'll add on the first time and we don't get an error. So HTML builder plus equals, so now we have this variable that's going to keep getting added to, and just to show you what it's doing, let me start with that. All right, and so now when I refresh this, you'll see first that variable equals a one line. The second time the variable equals more, and the third time the variable equals even more. And so the way I want to do that now is instead of when I write it to the page, I'm actually going to write whatever HTML builder equals. Okay, so let's walk through what's happening. Run through a loop for as long or as many times as there are teams and get the wins and the losses for each one of those teams, save it into this variable, and then when we're done doing the loop, go ahead and write all the data that you just stored to the page. Okay, and I got undefined. So let me see what I did wrong. Stand by. What did I do wrong? I didn't save it. Just sometimes you just get in. I missed it. It went too fast. Command S, save it, and refresh, and that's what happened. So sorry about that. All right, so now you'll see Braves wins, losses. Now the formatting's not great. So you know what you might do is come in here and do a plus, and then quote BR or /BR, and put them all on another line. Okay, so I just wrote a little bit of HTML in there, and you know while you're at it, you could even put it bold or whatever, any tag, any HTML tag you could put in there. And so here we are starting to write out HTML code using JavaScript. Okay, so that's an example of a for loop with 3 different arrays that we were pulling in, and then we concatenated that information, and then when the loop was done, we wrote that information to the page. We will do that a lot in this class, and so that's a skill that you're going to want to use for working with data and be able to present that onto the page. So now let's look at a while loop. When your computer is turned on, there is a while loop going on. It basically runs a test that says, is the power switch on? Is the power switch on? Is the power switch on? And as long as it is set to true, as long as the power switch is on, then it will continue to stay on. But the moment that that power switch turns off, it'll say, is the power switch on? False. Then it will shut down the computer. That's a basic while loop. So for as long as something is still true, or you can reverse it, but for as long as it's true, keep doing something. So for example, in the one we have here on the slides here, so we have I equals 0, while teams, and we have, remember, 3 items in there. So while it is there, go ahead and do this and write the name of the teams. This does the exact same thing as the for loop in this particular case. So there are 2 different ways of doing the same thing, but the for loop is a more kind of, it's the way we will do it because we have a little bit more control, and I like being able to use the length property to be able to decide how many times it's going to run. But both of them work in both cases. All right. So now we've done a for loop with an array, and we also have if statements. And if statements are logic operators and not operators. They're logic statements that help us to determine if something is true or false and helps us to solve problems. And we can use operators inside of an if statement to help us navigate that. So if we look at this example here in the slides, if x is equal to 10, log true. Otherwise, log false. Okay, a very simple if statement. Okay, so go ahead and do this. Note that when we write an if statement, we do if parentheses, very similar to the for loop. And I'm going to go here into our code and do that just so you can see it. So if parentheses, and then the 2 things that you want to compare. So x is equal to 10, but we didn't just have to do equal to. We can do if x is less than 10 or less than or equal to 10, and we can do any of our logical operators. Okay, and then we say, put our code that we want to happen if it's true here. Oops, wrong color, wrong directional bracket, sorry. There we go. Okay, so that is if x is greater than or equal to 10, and in our case, x is equal to 2, so you'll see that would never happen, okay? It will never be greater than or equal to 10. We can also do an else, so if it's never going to happen, else, and that's essentially another if statement, but it's if it's not true. Console log false. Now notice that it's not, when I currently am running it right now, it's not in a loop. So this will only happen once. So basically say, does x equal 10? Or is it greater than or equal to 10? The answer is no. And so this will run one time, and so it should log false. And I wrote that poorly. Let me fix that. And so there's a false right there at the end. Okay. So there's a basic if statement. Let's tell you how we can use that. Now, that was outside of the loop. Let's put one in the loop, because this is a really nice way of determining a problem that we might want to solve, determining an answer. So I'm going to remove that one because we don't really need that one right now. And then let's go inside of our loop, and let's go ahead and do a little bit of logical, just to determine which team has the best record. So maybe we want to say which teams are good. So if losses, okay, of I, because that's how many times we're going to be there. So we're going to compare each team. If the losses of whichever team we're looking at is greater than or equal to 60, console.log this team is horrible. Sorry. And else console.log. So if they have less than 60 wins in this case, this team is not that bad. All right, so I like to, when I'm learning a new thing or learning a new language, I always want to make sure that I put in my if statement or run my loop and I think about what the log is going to say or what the output's going to be before I do it. That way I know if it's right or wrong, and it helps me to make sure I've thought through this properly. So in our case, the Braves has 58 losses. So in this case, it should say the Braves are not that bad, or this team is not that bad. So if I refresh that, you see, we still have all of our other messages, but this team is not that bad. So Braves, this team is not that bad. Okay. Yankees, this team is horrible. I'm not a big Yankees fan, as you'll see in all of our data that we'll see today. I'm not a Yankees fan, and so yes, this team is horrible. And Nationals, this team is not that bad. That's actually my second team because I lived in DC for a while, and so I pull for the Nationals when I'm not pulling for the Braves, even though they're in the same division. Sorry. All right, so we have our if statement that is testing the losses data against a particular number. Okay. So let's go in and work with that, but let's go ahead and make our display a little bit nicer because this is some ugly HTML text. Okay, so inside the HTML builder, we can add things like we can define the H2, but we don't want to do it on every single one of them. We could do it either outside the loop. So I could take HTML builder equals, put everything in an H2, which is actually not really that great format to put the whole thing in H2, but I can put teams, and maybe I do colon like that, and then slash H2. And then remember, I could also concatenate it. Equals, using plus equals. And then so I'll add to that, and I'm going to use div class equals team list. You'll note that, something's not working right. See, when we have HTML that has double quotes and we're using quotes in our JavaScript, it really makes things a mess. So what we want to do is whenever we want to keep the double quotes for HTML, I use single quotes for my JavaScript. So I can put a single quote at the beginning and a single quote at the end, and that way it doesn't mess up and it keeps these double quotes in here. And so whenever you're doing HTML, it's good to get in the habit of putting it in single quotes. Okay. Now, what you will see is sometimes you'll get errors. Sorry, because your Atom or your IDE sometimes adds the double quotes because like when you put a quote, it's trying to like pre-format it for you, and so you'll note that I had to delete their last one. That's why we got the little error there. So I'm going to save that, and you'll see I've now created a div class to put this in, and let's go ahead and we could close it here at the end if we wanted to, right? So we could take right before we write it, HTML builder plus equals closing div. So now all the teams will go inside the team list div. Okay, so there's our H2, and we could inspect it and see that we have a div class called team list. But if you look at your HTML, there is no team list, right? There is no team list class, but there is when it's rendered in the browser because we added that at runtime via JavaScript. So we can add CSS classes when we want to based on logic. And so that's a really powerful tool. A couple of other things that I want to tell you about arrays is we have some functions that help us to add and remove data to and from arrays. So we can push items into an array. So if we push it, it will automatically add it to the end of the array. So in this example, we have 3 items. If I do a array name dot push, so teams dot push and then 34, it would have added 34 to the end of that. The other way is sometimes you want something to go to the front of the line. You want to jump them in at the very beginning, and you can use the name dot unshift and pass in the variable that you want. So in our case, we're going to pass in 34, and so you'll see 34 goes to the beginning of the array. We also have shift and pop, and these are for removing. So the first two were for adding, these are for removing. So we can shift, which will remove the first item from the array. So if we want to take out something, so let's just say we've accessed this particular value, we don't need it anymore, we can pull that out. So we've accessed the first item, 10, we don't need it anymore, so we say run a shift on it, and it will basically remove it. So they're out of line now. And pop basically will pop it off the end. Okay, so removes the last item. So maybe we were done with that one and we wanted to remove that. So shift and pop are two ways of removing them. Push and unshift are ways of adding information. So what I want you to do now is using the data that we were using with the 3 teams and the 3 sets of wins and losses. I want you to see if you can figure out which team has the most wins. You're going to need to use a loop. You're going to need to use an array and an if statement. Okay, and also I'll go ahead and give you this hint. I created 2 extra variables. I say an additional one here, but I created 2 additional variables to kind of store some information to give me something to work with to think about. So think about it for a minute. I want you to pause the video and I want you to work through this for at least 20 minutes. If you can't figure it out in 20 minutes, then start the video back and I will explain on how to do it. So determine which team has the most wins and log it in the console. So I hope you figured it out. Let me walk you through how I solved the problem. And there actually is a little bit of a flaw in mine, but what I wanted you to do is to just kind of see the basics of working with loops and if statements. And there are other ways you would do this, but this is the most simple way that's for you to learn from. So I'm going down here in my JavaScript and I just kind of put in a comment here to tell me what I'm doing. And I did this below, so you'll still have access to see what we did before. But the data is still up here. We still have this. And I created 2 new variables because I needed to store who the current at any given state is, who the current leader is, and then what were their number of wins. So if we think about this logically, it's going through this loop and it's at any given time in that loop, I need to know who the current leader is. So I created 2 variables, one called temp high wins, so the one with the number with the most wins, and temp leader, so which one is the leader. Now you could have done it with just 1 variable, but it's easier to think about it with 2. So we have a for loop, just like we did before, based off the length of teams. And then inside that for loop, we have an if statement. So if the wins is greater than or equal to temp high wins, then set the wins and set a new leader. Okay, so the first time through it equals 0. Okay, so temp high wins is equal to 0. So if, in our case, the data says 62. So if 62 is greater than or equal to 0, which it should be, then go ahead and set the leader to whoever's first, right? So the first time through, in this case, that was the Braves. Then the second time through the loop, what it's going to do is it's going to say 58. Is 58 greater than or equal to 62? because 62 was stored on the previous time through the loop. So is 58 greater than or equal to 52? No, it's not. So none of this happens, and so it still keeps the Braves as the leader. Third time through the loop, it's going to look at 66. And so it's going to say, is 66 greater than 62? Yes. And now it's going to set the Nationals, and the Nationals wins. And so now the team with the most wins should be Nationals. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh that and look at our console, and we can see it didn't run. Stand by. I did it again. Save it and refresh it. There it is. The team with the most wins of 66 is, I should have said are, the Nationals. Okay, so we have solved that with basic logic. Now, if you see my problem would be is if I had two teams with the same number of wins and a tie, it would fail. But I just wanted you to kind of see this example of how you can use an if statement inside of a loop with arrays to solve and figure out an answer. Now what I want you to do is you are going to use JavaScript to create this HTML table. It's very simple. I don't need you to do any CSS. You don't have to make Bootstrap in it. It's a literal simple table that has teams, wins, and losses. And you're going to list the teams, the wins, and losses in a nice little table using table rows. And you're going to do that in a loop. And then once you get that, I want you to bold the team with the lead. Okay, so in your folder for today's class, I've included a file called data.js, and it actually has a lot more teams for you to work with. It has all the National League teams. And so I want you to copy and paste that data and put that into your JavaScript code. You would do this with JSON or another format as we get farther down in the semester, but just for right now, I wanted to give you that. So what you're going to do is you're going to copy that and you're going to bring that back over, and that's going to replace your team's data here. So you can just replace that here and then run your logic on it. So you can delete all the other stuff we were doing. You can comment it out, whatever you want to do. You can even create a new file and do it, whatever works best for you. But what I want to see is you writing this HTML table, and you bold the team with the most wins. Okay. That's your assignment. You'll turn that in by putting that on GitHub and putting that on your server. And as always, you're going to give me 2 links on the Sakai site. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'm happy to help either in the class time or on Slack.